Henri de Grammont, a chevalier from a noble but impoverished family, was more than just an adventurer. He was a gambler, a duelist, a frequenter of Parisian slums, and most importantly, a man whose reputation preceded him. Forced to flee France after a series of scandals and insurmountable debts, he boarded a ship bound for the West Indies. What began as a desperate escape became his triumph. In the Caribbean Sea, where law was merely a word and fortune the only currency, Grammont didn't just survive. He flourished. He wasn't a common privateer clinging to someone else's ship. He assembled his own fleet. He plundered not only Spanish galleons, but entire cities, Maracaibo, Cartagena, Campeche. Each daring attack, each captured trophy transformed him from a fugitive nobleman into a formidable freebooter whose name struck terror from Panama to Havana. He didn't just command pirates. He became their undisputed leader, their general. By the mid-1680s, Chevalier de Grammont had become so influential that the French crown, which had once banished him, now saw him not as a mere cutthroat, but as a potential instrument of its imperial policy. He was offered high positions, even the governorship of Tortuga, but he preferred the freedom of the sea and the clang of gold. And then, in 1687, after another successful expedition, his ship simply vanished somewhere in the Caribbean Sea. No wreckage, no bodies, no witnesses. Just emptiness. This is where the legend begins. Many imagine him as a noble knight, a hero of France whose life was dedicated to fighting for the crown. But let's be honest, Henri de Grammont was not a knight, but a ruthless pirate. His actions were dictated by a lust for personal gain, not patriotic fervor. He was a criminal whom circumstances and the lawlessness of the era elevated to the heavens, before the sea swallowed him without a trace. His name was a challenge, his birth a sentence. Henri de Grammont belonged to a noble but impoverished family, whose estates had long since become a mirage, and their wealth a hazy memory. In the 17th century, when status defined everything, this was not just poverty, but a brand, an indelible shame he felt on every street of Paris. The young Chevalier, forced to exist in the luxurious world of the French capital without adequate means, desperately clung to the illusion of past grandeur. He tried to maintain a facade worthy of his name and ancestors, but this facade demanded exorbitant expenses that his family could no longer afford. Grammont lived in constant tension between the desire to live up to his origins and the harsh reality of financial ruin. This desperate situation drove him to risky gambles, where not only his fortune, but also the remnants of his reputation were at stake. Grammont didn't just play cards, he defied fate, trying to regain everything that had been lost with one successful move and avoid public condemnation. Every loss, every gambling debt, every duel fought for an honor that was already worthless, drew him deeper into a vortex from which there was no escape. His duels were not merely clashes of blades, but desperate attempts to defend a fading status, to prove to himself and the world that he was still the chevalier whose name once commanded respect, but now only pity or contempt. The scandals whispered throughout Paris were merely symptoms of this internal struggle and his inability to accept his own downfall. He could not afford to be an ordinary impoverished nobleman. He had to be either everything or nothing. It was this maxim, this internal imperative, that shaped his character and determined his path. He could not be content with little, could not accept defeat, could not live by rules that offered him no chance. And when debts became unbearable, and creditors too insistent, when each morning brought new threats and social ostracism became evident, his former life completely collapsed, leaving him on the edge of an abyss. His flight from France, described as a desperate measure, was in fact Grammont's only way out, his personal point of no return. He wasn't merely escaping justice or creditors, he was fleeing his former self, the expectations imposed upon him, and the oppressive poverty masquerading as aristocracy. It was an act of self-liberation, a severance from a social contract he could not fulfill, and a rejection of an identity that suffocated him. It was there, on the threshold of a new world, in the boundless expanse of the Caribbean Sea, that he decided to definitively break with the past. The Caribbean Sea didn't just offer him refuge, it gave him a new arena where his vices, greed, recklessness, cruelty, and boundless ambition could become instruments of power rather than causes of downfall. He was no longer Henri de Grammont, the chevalier from Paris, condemned to disgrace. He became what he was destined to be, a ruthless predator, forging his own destiny on the ruins of the old world, and by rules he set himself, without regard for others' ideals. The vast expanse of the Caribbean Sea in the 17th century was not merely a geographical space, but a tumultuous cauldron of geopolitical ambitions and desperate survival. Here, far from the strict regulations of European courts, rules were dictated not by royal decrees but by the roar of cannons and the gleam of boarding sabers. Great powers, Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, fought fiercely for dominance over this rich region. Their conflicts, often escalating into open warfare, created an ideal environment for those willing to live on the edge of a blade. The Spanish crown, having first claimed vast territories and fabled resources of the New World, sought to establish a monopoly on trade and extraction. But its colossal empire was too vast, and its fleet too slow, to effectively patrol thousands of miles of coastline and countless islands. Each new expedition, each newly founded outpost, only exacerbated the problem of control. Every year, heavily laden galleons, floating treasures targeted by anyone daring to challenge them, sailed from Portobello, Cartagena, and Veracruz, loaded with gold and silver. These riches, destined for European monarchs, became a powerful magnet for adventurers from all over the world. France, England, and the Netherlands, eager to carve out their share of the colonial pie, actively supported so-called privateers, essentially legalized pirates who were issued letters of marque. These documents, signed by kings, transformed common robbery into a perfectly legal military operation against enemy ships. The difference between a privateer and a pirate was often merely the presence or absence of such a paper, and even then, only as long as the paper was profitable. In reality, many captains who started as privateers easily crossed the line when political winds shifted or when their own pockets demanded more. They formed temporary but powerful alliances, uniting for large-scale raids on coastal cities and then dispersing until the next opportunity. The social fabric of the Caribbean was as chaotic as its political map. Fugitives flocked here. Desperate peasants, ruined nobles, deserting soldiers, former criminals, and those seeking freedom from European class restrictions. Here, it didn't matter who you were in Paris or London. What mattered was how sharp your mind, how quick your reaction, and how strong your hand. Society was formed on the principle of the survival of the fittest, where courage and ruthlessness were valued far above lineage. Loyalty was rare, and betrayal commonplace, reinforced only by short-term gain. This was a time when the state, represented by a distant crown, was too far away to impose its laws. Power belonged to whoever could take and hold it by force. Ports such as Tortuga or Port Royal became hotbeds of vice and prosperity, where gold changed hands at lightning speed, and a man's life was worth no more than a bottle of rum. It was in this anarchy, in this wild mix of greed, ambition, and freedom, that new rules of the game were formed. And it was here, in this lawless world, that Henri de Grammont found his true nature, transforming his former vices into deadly instruments of success that allowed him not just to survive, but to rise to the top. Upon arriving in the Caribbean, Henri de Grammont immediately faced a harsh reality. He had to start from scratch, without a fleet, without a crew, without the reputation he had lost in Paris, and without the one he still had to forge. His journey began on Tortuga, that island teeming with adventurers and cutthroats, where yesterday's noblemen could become tomorrow's prey. Grammont did not wait for mercy or luck. His first truly strategic scheme was less a robbery than a seizure of power. He quickly understood that in this world, strength was not just the roar of cannons, but also an unwavering will, a sharp mind, and a willingness to act without regard for morality. He, a man accustomed to the intrigues of Parisian salons, adapted with astonishing ease to the ruthless laws of the pirate brotherhood. Joining one of the many groups of buccaneers, Grammont did not remain a mere rank-and-file member for long. His aristocratic bearing, even in rags, and a cunning unusual for most pirates, quickly set him apart. He used his charisma and sharp intellect to methodically sow discord among leaders, exposing their weaknesses and playing on their ambitions until the opportune moment arose. When their captain, an old and short-sighted pirate, made a fatal mistake in distributing loot or in management, Grammont did not hesitate. He orchestrated a swift mutiny, coldly eliminating rivals and taking command of a small but well-armed vessel. This was not an act of nobility, but a pure, calculated takeover that demonstrated his ruthlessness and manipulative ability. With his first ship and a loyal, albeit small, crew in hand, Grammont knew it wasn't enough to build an empire. He needed a resounding success to attract more men and resources, to make a name for himself. His next target was chosen with his characteristic audacity and strategic calculation, which were alien to most of his colleagues. Instead of hunting lonely merchant ships, which was commonplace, he set his sights on a Spanish fort on the coast of modern-day Cuba. It was not a large garrison, but fortified enough to deter most pirates who preferred easy prey. Grammont conducted thorough reconnaissance, personally studying the coastline and identifying weaknesses in the defenses, as well as the habits of the Spanish soldiers. He devised a daring plan that involved a diversionary maneuver from the sea, simulating a frontal attack, and a hidden landing of the main assault force from land through swampy terrain that the Spanish considered absolutely impassable. The attack was swift and brutal. The Spanish garrison, caught off guard from two sides, could not offer decent resistance and was utterly routed. The fort was plundered clean. The spoils were significant. Valuable weapons, gunpowder, provisions, and most importantly, impressive reserves of gold destined for shipment to Spain. This victory not only enriched him and his crew, but instantly spread the fame of a new, ruthless captain who was not afraid to attack even fortified positions. New recruits flocked to him, the most desperate and ambitious, drawn by his luck, willingness to take risks, and, most importantly, his ability to win where others failed. These early successes allowed Grammont not just to survive, but to begin building something far greater than a mere pirate gang. He started assembling his own flotilla, attracting the most desperate and experienced captains, promising them untold riches and absolute freedom. It was then that he conceived one of his most cunning and large-scale operations, which finally cemented his reputation as a brilliant strategist. Learning of a large Spanish convoy transporting silver from Mexico to Havana, a target capable of making any pirate a king, Grammont realized that a frontal assault, even with his growing fleet, would be too risky and result in huge losses. Instead, he devised an elaborate trap. He deliberately spread false rumors of his presence in one area of the Caribbean while secretly moving his ships to a completely different one. Then, using captured Spanish flags and carefully studied signals, his ships mimicked friendly vessels, approaching the unsuspecting convoy under the guise of long-awaited reinforcements. The Spanish, unaware of the deception, allowed his ships to come close. The sudden attack, beginning with a treacherous point-blank shot, turned the heavily guarded convoy into a chaotic mess of burning ships and drowning men. This was not just a robbery. It was a demonstration of his unprecedented mastery of deception and tactics, which brought him not only untold treasures, unmatched in the Caribbean, but also the reputation of a formidable strategist, whose name was now uttered with dread from Panama to Havana. Henri de Grammont was no longer a fugitive hiding from the past. He was Henri de Grammont, a captain who not only overturned the rules of the game in the Caribbean, but began to transform its anarchy into his personal, ruthless empire. Building an empire on the ruins of the old world is one thing, but maintaining it is quite another. Henri de Grammont didn't just gather ships and plunder cities. He masterfully managed the most dangerous men in the Caribbean. His personal arsenal included not only blades and cannons, but also a deep understanding of human psychology, which he had honed in the salons of Paris. He knew that in a world dominated by greed, the most powerful incentive was the promise of untold riches. Grammont didn't just promise, he delivered. Each successful expedition, each captured galleon, became tangible proof of his ability to lead men to unimaginable treasures. He generously shared the spoils, instilling among his buccaneers an unwavering belief in his luck, and more importantly, in their own benefit from following him. This was not mere loyalty, but calculated subservience based on a constant influx of gold. His charisma was not the charm of an aristocrat, but an instrument of power. Grammont possessed the rare gift of sensing the mood of the crowd, instantly assessing the strengths and weaknesses of everyone before him. He could be a ruthless tyrant, inspiring terror with a single glance, and simultaneously an inspiring leader capable of boosting the morale of desperate cutthroats. He spoke to them in their language, understanding their desire for freedom, their hatred of the Spanish, and their thirst for revenge for past grievances. He skillfully played on these emotions, transforming a motley crowd of adventurers into a single, albeit deadly, organism. He didn't just give orders, he instilled confidence in victory. even when the odds were negligible. To manage his growing flotilla, Grammont did not rely on blind luck. He built a system of influence where every element was in its place. He personally selected his captains, not by nobility or origin, but by their actual skills and ruthlessness. These experts, whether experienced navigators, cold-blooded gunners, or natural boarding tacticians, received exceptional privileges and autonomy, but their absolute loyalty to Grammont was undeniable. He masterfully used their ambitions, pitting their interests against each other so that no one could become too influential except himself. He was the center around which this entire lawless world revolved. It was Grammont who was the architect of his own legend. He understood that in the Caribbean, reputation was capital, no less valuable than gold. Rumors of his daring raids, his untold riches, his invulnerability. He didn't just allow them to spread. He actively contributed to their creation. He might release prisoners with a message exaggerating his forces, or ostentatiously leave some loot behind to sow fear and respect. His name became synonymous not only with danger, but with inevitable success. He cultivated the image of a man who always wins, creating an aura of invincibility around himself that attracted more and more adventurers dreaming of sharing his glory and wealth. This capacity for total adaptation, from an impoverished Parisian nobleman to a ruthless pirate general, became his greatest strength. He did not merely adapt to the Caribbean, he reshaped it to his will. He discarded the unnecessary conventions of the old world, retaining only those qualities that served his purposes: a sharp mind, strategic thinking, and an absolute lack of moral inhibitions. He was not a prisoner of his past, but its architect. He didn't just survive an anarchy, he thrived in it, transforming chaos into an ordered system where he was the sole law. Henri de Grammont, having risen to the pinnacle of lawlessness, was not a lone wolf in this wild game. His daring raids, though driven by personal greed, paradoxically served the interests of powerful patrons whose hands remained clean. The French crown, which had once outlawed him, now turned a blind eye to his depredations, and at times even tacitly encouraged them. In the 17th century, colonial dominance was defined not only by direct military confrontations, but also by asymmetric warfare. Freebooters like Grammont became an ideal tool for weakening the Spanish monopoly in the New World without a direct declaration of war. The governors of French colonies, particularly in Tortuga and Saint-Domingue, were the main beneficiaries and unspoken sponsors of his activities. For them, Grammont was not just a pirate, but a mobile strike force capable of inflicting damage on Spanish trade routes and settlements, diverting Madrid's forces, and clearing the way for French expansion. They provided him with safe harbors for ship repairs, opportunities to resupply, and a market for his plunder, while receiving their share, which could be easily laundered or used to strengthen their own positions. These officials, formally representing the law, were in fact accomplices, reaping fabulous profits and strategic advantages, while Grammont terrorized the Spanish. Their tacit approval and logistical support were no less crucial to his success than his own tactical genius and ruthlessness. But if some saw him as a useful ally, others considered him a mortal enemy. The Spanish Empire, whose silver convoys and fortified cities were Grammont's primary targets, could not tolerate his existence. For Madrid, he was not just a pirate, but a symbol of their complete impotence in the Caribbean Sea. The main antagonist whose shadow constantly pursued Grammont was the very might of the Spanish crown, represented by its admirals and governors who had sworn to eradicate the freebooters. One such implacable enemy was Don Juan de Guzman, commander of the Spanish fleet in terra firma, a man whose reputation was built on his merciless fight against piracy. He dedicated years of his life to pursuing privateers, viewing them as a personal affront to the crown's honor. Grammont's clashes with the Spanish fleet were inevitable and often ended in bloody battles. Don Juan, possessing vast resources and deep knowledge of the region, repeatedly tried to trap Grammont. He reinforced garrisons, dispatched patrol squadrons, and even infiltrated spies into pirate communities to obtain information about Grammont's plans. Each new victory for Grammont was a personal defeat for Don Juan, undermining his authority and intensifying Madrid's wrath. This struggle between two irreconcilable forces, a predator reshaping the world map and a defender of the old order attempting to hold on to a fading empire, became one of the central dramas of the 17th century Caribbean. It determined not only the fates of individual ships and cities, but also shaped the geopolitical landscape of an entire region, where personal vendetta and state interests intertwined into a single deadly knot. In 1687, Henri de Grammont stood at the apex of his pirate empire. His name, once a whisper of fear, now echoed like thunder across the entire Caribbean Sea, from Spanish fortresses to French ports. He was not merely a captain, he was a general, commanding a flotilla of over 10 vessels, having gathered thousands of cutthroats under his flag, each of whom believed in his invincibility and boundless luck. The crown of France, which had once banished him, now offered him gubernatorial posts, seeing in him not a criminal, but a powerful force capable of serving its interests in the New World. But Grammont, whose thirst for gold was insatiable and whose desire for absolute freedom was insuperable, rejected these offers. He preferred the wild, unpredictable life of a freebooter, where each new raid promised not only wealth, but also confirmation of his status as master of the Caribbean. His last enterprise, launched in that same year of 1687, was typical of his grand-scale and reckless confidence. Sources vary in details, but most agree that Grammont targeted an exceptionally valuable Spanish convoy, or even a major city considered absolutely impregnable. This was a challenge not just to the Spanish crown, but to fate itself, another, even more audacious step toward absolute power. He gathered his best ships, his most experienced captains, and the elite of his buccaneer army. The calculation was impeccable, the preparation thorough, and the anticipation of victory universal. And he won again. The expedition, like many before it, was successful. The spoils, according to rumors, were fabulous. Cargoes of silver, jewels, captured prisoners, gold enough to supply an entire army for years. With victory in hand, Grammont and his flotilla headed back to the safe harbors of Tortuga or Saint-Domingue to divide the plunder and enjoy their well-deserved glory. But it was here, at the peak of his triumph, that Chevalier de Grammont made his last, fatal mistake. It was not a tactical blunder in battle, nor an underestimation of the enemy, but something far more fundamental. He forgot that above him, above his genius and his ruthlessness, there was always an even more powerful force, nature itself. The Caribbean Sea, which had so long served as his arena for triumphs, suddenly revealed its true, merciless nature. A hurricane unexpectedly struck, one of those fierce tropical storms that turn azure waters into a boiling hell and mighty ships into splinters. This was not a battle with an enemy where Grammont's tactics and cunning could give him an advantage. This was a struggle against the elements, unlike anything he had perhaps ever seen. No witnesses remained. No one saw how Grammont's flagship, Le Grand Diable, or any other vessel from his flotilla, met its doom. They simply ceased to be at some point after the storm subsided. No wreckage, no bodies, no traces. Not a single survivor who could recount the final moments. Henri de Grammont, the man who reshaped the rules of the Caribbean, vanished without a sound, swallowed by the fathomless blue. His end was not a heroic death in battle, nor a shameful capture or execution. It was the final act of the sea itself, silent, absolute, erasing all traces. It was not a fall, but a dissolution, a perfect, if eerie, end for a man who had been a phantom pursuing others' treasures his entire life. His disappearance did not expose his weakness, but merely underscored nature's relentlessness and the ultimate price for the boundless freedom and power he so craved. The Caribbean Sea, which had given him everything, took him without a trace, leaving behind only a legend that grew from this inexplicable void. The disappearance of Henri de Grammont into the depths of the Caribbean Sea meant not only the end of his personal odyssey, but also the sudden loss of untold riches. The fabled spoils of his last, triumphant expedition, cargoes of silver, jewels, and gold, enough to supply an entire army for years, were forever lost to the seabed, never reaching the shores of Tortuga or Saint-Domingue. For the French crown and its colonial governors, who had tacitly patronized Grammont for years, his demise was a significant financial blow. They lost not only their immense share of this particular plunder, but also their most effective and low-cost instrument for undermining the Spanish monopoly. Grammont was their mobile strike force, and his disappearance left a huge void in their asymmetric war against Madrid. Among the buccaneers of the Caribbean, the disappearance of their general immediately sparked chaos. Thousands of cutthroats, accustomed to his invincibility and generosity, suddenly found themselves leaderless. This led to a fierce power struggle among ambitious captains, each striving to take Grammont's place, but none possessed his strategic genius and charisma. A period of anarchy and scattered raids replaced organized, large-scale operations, which significantly reduced the overall effectiveness of the pirate movement. For the Spanish Empire, whose convoys and cities had suffered for years from Grammont's raids, his sudden disappearance came as an unexpected relief. Although they did not know the exact reason, the pressure on their trade routes significantly eased. Don Juan de Guzman, an implacable enemy of the buccaneers, could breathe a sigh of relief, albeit without triumph, as he had failed to defeat his personal foe in battle. This allowed Spain to temporarily regroup its forces and strengthen its positions, though the fundamental problems of its colonial empire remained unresolved. However, Grammont's silent disappearance from reality was followed by a resounding explosion of his name in myths and legends. Soon after his vanishing, when the need for his ruthlessness waned and the memory of his atrocities faded, the French crown and colonial officials began covertly rewriting his history. From a fugitive nobleman and ruthless buccaneer, whose actions were dictated solely by personal gain, he gradually transformed into a noble corsair, almost a knight, who sacrificed his life for the interests of France. His plundering of Spanish galleons and cities was now presented not as acts of piracy, but as strategic operations within a geopolitical struggle, heroic deeds performed in the name of the crown. This carefully cultivated narrative, reinforced by the absence of witnesses to his true end, allowed inconvenient details to be erased: his cruelty, greed, betrayals, and his refusal to become governor, preferring chaos and gold. Society needed a hero, and Grammont, with his audacity and incredible successes, perfectly fit this role, even if his image had to be significantly embellished. The paradox of his legacy lies precisely in this: a man who throughout his life rejected all rules and authorities, who built his empire on blood and deceit, was posthumously assimilated by the very system he essentially rebelled against. His personal anarchy was reformatted into state strategy, and his vices into the virtues of a patriot. The story of Chevalier de Grammont is not just a chronicle of one pirate's life. It is a powerful reminder of how easily truth can be distorted in the name of a convenient legend. It demonstrates that in history, especially history where direct evidence is lacking, what matters is not so much the fact itself, but how it is interpreted and for what purposes it is used. Grammont became a mirror reflecting not so much his true personality as the needs and ambitions of those who remained after him. His fate, a desperate escape from disgrace, an ascent to the pinnacle of power in a world of lawlessness, and then silent absorption by the elements, left behind not only an unsolved mystery, but also a universal lesson about the fragility of reputation and the omnipotence of narrative. Ultimately, it doesn't matter who you truly were. If your story serves someone's purposes, it will live on, transformed and adapted, forever. His name ceased to be the name of a man, becoming a symbol that everyone could imbue